All right, everyone can hear me? So great to see so many people here. I really did think that a web forms talk at the Build conference would get 30 or 40 people. I even took a bet internally, and I've lost, obviously, because there's nearly 100 people here, which is fantastic. Welcome, I am Damien Edwards. I am the program manager for ASP.NET. So things I look after are the ASP.NET core runtime itself and the core infrastructure, as well as the web forms platform or framework that sits on top of that. Also look after a couple of other things, the Ajax CDN, some of the legacy Ajax stuff that we still support today. So it's great to see so many people here who want to learn about some of the stuff coming in the next version of web forms. How many people have seen any of the other talks I've given this year on web forms 4.5? Okay, hardly anybody, like 2 or 3. That's really, really good. There will be a little bit of overlap for those 2 or 3 people, but I do have a lot of content. I only have 60 minutes today. These are very short sessions, but I do hope to get towards some more stuff at the end that I haven't actually shown publicly yet, which is kind of cool. So our agenda, now who's going to benefit? Well, ASP.NET Web Forms developers. I'm assuming you're all web forms developers or you're curious MVC developers, because one of my charters is to really try and bring the sexy back to web forms. A lot of people still use web forms. You know, our figures suggest anywhere between 80 and 90% of our customers are still predominantly using web forms when they use ASP.NET. So it's certainly not going anywhere anytime quickly, and we are definitely continuing to invest in it. And so with Web Forms 4.5, which is part of the .NET 4.5 developer preview that you now all have access to, hopefully you'll see that we've done a lot of great improvements in this next version, and we're really keen to get your feedback so that we can make adjustments to the features that we've added so that once we finally release, it's going to be a great platform for you to use. Who in here is an MVC developer? Okay, and who, if you don't consider yourself an MVC developer but you have knowledge of MVC, some of the concepts and things like that? Okay, good. That's excellent. Fantastic. Because what we'll see is that as we've looked at developing the next version of web forms, for inspiration, we tend to look at not just other frameworks from other companies, but also at the office next to me where Phil Hack sits, and look at what MVC has done. I mean, the thing to remember is that ASP.NET is bigger than either web forms or MVC. And if you look at some concepts in MVC, a lot of those started out in web forms. If you look at the HTML helper concepts in MVC, where the UI is template-driven, well, that all came from dynamic data. How many people use dynamic data in web forms? Okay, a few people. I'm going to show a little bit of that today. And so that came from web forms originally. And then what we'll see today is that there have been some features that we've taken from MVC or been inspired by, and we've brought those back into web forms, like model binding. So these are the topics. I'm going to have a quick overview of the various data access paradigms that our platform is kind of geared to support these days, and in particular the data access paradigm that the model binding features in web forms are really, really designed to work well with. And then I'm going to do basically an enormous end-to-end demo. I'm just going to code up a system pretty much from scratch with some help from snippets and stuff on the way to show you and highlight all of these new features and how they work together. And then if I get enough time, I'm going to show you some sort of ad hoc extra sort of demos to do with this as well. And what you'll leave with, obviously, is, hey, ASP.NET is great, web forms is awesome, data binding is more powerful and simpler in the next version, and everyone is happy. So let's do a quick refresh of the data access paradigms that we generally deal with as ASP.NET developers on the .NET platform. So the first one we have is this idea of database first. And a lot of people deal in this world where there's an existing relational database system, probably SQL or Oracle, and they start with a schema, the one that's in the database, and then they want to generate a model being classes that you can interact with in your code to then talk to the database. Now, if you're a web forms developer and you use the SQL data source or the link data source or the entity data source today, that's totally fine. If you're happy working in that way, in that paradigm where you simply have your UI talk directly to the database and you rely on those rich controls to do that work, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But a lot of developers like to have a lot more control about that data access moving back and forward from the data tier through to the UI framework tier. And so that's where we start looking at code access, code approaches for doing data access. One of those is model first. So this is where we, instead of starting with the database, we design an entity model. And we do that using the tooling available in Visual Studio for Entity Framework. Or you could have done this with Link to SQL. So you drag some things around on a design surface, that spits out some classes that you can then interact with in code or via the entity data source, and then you interact with those as part of your application to do your CRUD operations. The last one, which is what EF added in 4.1, is this idea of code-first data access. So rather than starting with a schema in the database or generating code from an entity data model that you created with some design tools, you just start writing code. You say, well, I want to create a database that looks like this, or I want to work with a model set that looks like this, and you just write classes. You create a customer class, you create an issues class, you create an orders class, et cetera, and then you create a very thin context class that you use to so that EF can talk to the database and that the database can talk to you. And that's where you do all of your code access through. So these are the three paradigms that we generally talk about, and you can do hybrids as well. So for instance, if you have an existing database schema, like Northwind, and you want to create classes that use the EF code-first APIs, there are power tools that you can get from the EF team that will help generate those classes for you so you don't have to go and hand code them. So then you're using the code-first APIs, but you really started with the database first. And that's a fairly common approach too for people like those APIs. So let's have a very quick demo of what these things are, just to give you a refresh. Ooh, 2 screens, nice. So I've just got a standard web application here. If I go add new, not add reference, if I go add new item, and we start out with that idea of database first, come into data, I can say, I'm going to go ahead and add an entity data model, which I'm struggling to see. There it is. And I get a few choices here. Do I want to start with generating something from a database? Do I want to start with a model that's generated, or do I want to go ahead and build a model myself? So I'm going to say generate from a database. And then I can say, well, what I want to connect to. In this case, I'm just going to connect to Northwind. Hit next. Now it's going to go off and retrieve all the information from Northwind. I can say, yes, I want all the tables, I want all the views, and I want all the stored procedures. We can see all those tables in there. Click Finish, and Entity Framework, the design tools go off and create me a bunch of classes that I can now use in my application, either from code or using something like the entity data source to interact with my database. And then what we get is this entity data model design surface so that I can make changes to these moving forward. So who uses this approach today? Okay, quite a few people. Okay, that's cool. That's cool. All right, so that's starting with the database and generating a model. And if you want to start, rather than generating it from the database, you wanted to start with a blank design surface, you could obviously just do that. So you could say new data model. Rather than generating from a database, you could just start dragging on entities and inheritance and things like that and build up your database using the toolboxes in there. Who's done it that way before? Like, who's designed their model as an entity model first, okay, and then let EF generate? Not many people, okay. So what we're going to focus on today is this idea of a code-focused data access paradigm. So even though Web Forms is able to work with any one of these paradigms or a hybrid of them, it really, really loves working with data, and it really does support each of these modes very, very well. The one that it hasn't particularly supported well is the code-first paradigm. So who likes to write the code that deals with the database manually? Who likes to have that level of control? Okay, few people, okay. Traditionally, we haven't done this very, very well. We have a number of ways. So from 1.1, you could have a grid view. You set the data source property from code, and then you manually call the data bind method. I think, who's done that? Everybody does that, right? Okay. And then in 2.0, we introduce these data source controls, like the entity data source, the linked data source, and the SQL data source. And with those, you didn't have to write any code to get going. You simply drag these things on, use the wizard and the designer to sort of hook them up to your database. And then it wasn't until a little bit after that that you generally had to start writing code to handle events on the controls, get things to rebind at the right time. If you were doing custom validation, that was a real pain because you had to throw exceptions from your code and all this type of stuff. It really wasn't a fantastic way of doing things. And if you were using the object data source, I mean, who's used the object data source for their own code? Okay, a bunch of people. There were a lot of limitations with the object data source. The great things about it were that if you used it with things like the grid view and the form view, you automatically got support for sorting and paging and that sort of stuff as long as you implemented the correct signature on your methods. But it had some limitations. You couldn't bind to objects that were more than one level deep. So your UI model had to be very shallow. And it really wasn't very complex in how it worked. And as I said, when you started to do anything any more complicated than the demos that we showed you, you had to go and write a whole lot of code to make that stuff work. And so the aim with model binding really is to make data binding simpler and more powerful in 4.5. Make it easier to write code to deal with data in your web forms applications without you getting stuck doing all of that left-hand, right-hand type of stuff. Dealing with user input and trying to convert it from one value type into another, handle exceptions or handle errors and all that type of thing, get those back on the page. And so that's where we come to model binding. So before I go into a demo, I mean, the term model binding is taken from MVC. So if you've, in the world of MVC, model binding is this system that when you call an action method, it has parameters, and you have to get values into those parameters somehow. And the model binding system is the thing that takes the values from the query string and the form collection and the cookie collection and binds those onto those parameters. And what we're going to see is a very similar concept with model binding and web forms, but the context has slightly changed. We kind of do it at a different point because we have a page lifecycle and things like that to deal with. So that's enough slides. I don't think I have any more slides. Let's close this and let's just go ahead and build some stuff. So what we're going to do is build an issue, a very, very simple issue tracking system as our demonstration here. So we're going to start out by using a code-first approach. So I'm going to build some classes to represent the model that I want my database to look like. So I'm going to add myself a model folder. And then inside the model folder, I'm going to add myself an issue class. And rather than typing all this out, I do have a snippet for this. Okay, so I can import a few namespaces here. So what I've done is created a class called issue as a bunch of properties on it that represent the value on my model that I want to store. And this is going to turn into a database table when EF gets involved. I've decorated it with some data annotations. Now, if you've used dynamic data or MVC or Silverlight or WPF or any of those frameworks, you'll be aware of what these data annotations are all about. It's nice that they're common across all of our UI frameworks now. So here I'm saying the title is required. It has a string length of 100, meaning it has to be less than or equal to 100. And similarly, I've used those on other properties there. And there's a whole suite of these data annotations available in the framework. And we've added a whole bunch more in 4.5, things like email and credit card and telephone and that type of thing as well, so that your validation can be specified in one place. So that's easy. So next I'm going to go ahead and add a class that represents the context that I'm going to use to talk to the database. So we'll call this the issues DB. And I'm going to get rid of that. Again, I'll use actually I'll just do this by hand, I think. So I'm going to inherit from the DB context, and I'm going to say it's going to be a DB context. We'll just do this. Nope, done that wrong. Sorry, excuse me. I do have a snippet for this. No, I don't. Let's try that again. And it helps if I actually add a reference to Entity Framework. So I'm going to go ahead and install Entity Framework from NuGet, because, of course, NuGet is awesome. Now I can use a DB context. And then inside here, I'm just going to add a property to represent that table. So I want a DB set of issue. I'm just going to call that issues. Okay. So now I have a DB context that I can interact with in order to talk to my database. And I have a single entity that I'm going to use in this side of this database. Next, I'm going to add a connection string so that Entity Framework actually knows how to do this. So Control-K, Control-X. So the convention for Entity Framework code first is that if you have a connection string with the same name as your context class, that's the one it'll use. I don't have to do any other configuration to tell it that's where it is. It's just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to connect to SQL Server, and then I'm going to let EF take care of creating this database for me. But I want to do something a little bit more fancy. I want to customize how the database gets initialized when it's created. In this case, I want to insert some seed data into the database so that it's not completely empty when it gets created. So again, I'm just going to add another class. We'll call it the IssuesDB initializer, and I'll try and spell it right. Initializer. And I have a snippet for that one as well. So what this is going to do is, again, I'm inheriting from an existing initializer that Entity Framework gives me, which says just drop and recreate the database if the model changes. Don't recommend that you do this in your own applications. Dropping the database every time something in your model changes is generally not a good idea. There are other ones that you can use. Throw an exception if the model changes. And with the EF migrations framework that's currently being developed, you can manage the migration from one version of your model to another using the EF system as well. All I have to do here is override the seed method, and then as you can see, I'm just adding a bunch of issues to the database so that when it gets created, I have some data to work with in the first place. Okay, so that's good. That all builds. Let's go ahead and add some UI to show these things on the page. So I'm going to go ahead and add myself an issues grid. We'll do this way. So we've got a grid view, run out equals server. I'll call that my issues grid. And now we have to set this grid up for using model binding. So I'm going to be in code a lot here because I know a lot of web forms developers like to work in code. And this system really is designed to work well with people who spend a lot of time doing coding. So what I can do is say the select method that you need to call in order for this grid view to get its data is something. So we'll call this getIssues. Now, if you've used the object data source before, this will look kind of familiar. So the model binding system in ASP.NET Web Forms is really a merge, in a lot of ways, a merge of concepts from the object data source and the model binding system in MVC. And we've merged them together in a way that we think makes it much more simple and more powerful to do data binding. Don't think of model binding as an extra way of doing data binding. It's an enhancement to the existing data binding system in ASP.NET. So you're not doing anything particularly different. There's not a separate data binding stage in the page lifecycle. This is normal data binding. It's just been enhanced with these new features. The other thing I can do here is set the model type of this grid view. So I can tell the model binding system, when you're binding, the type of item you're going to be getting is a type of foo. Well, in this case, it's going to be a type of build01.model.issue because that's my issue class here. And why that's useful is that traditionally, when you go to create data binding expressions in here, so I'm going to go ahead and add some fields in here. And I'll just turn auto data binding, auto generate fields off. Okay, so bound fields is kind of a bad example because I just set the data field using a string. But if I was using something like a template field in here, so we can do that. And one of the great new things about the tooling support in Visual Studio here, I'll watch this again. So I open my angle bracket and I say TF because I know it's a template field, and hey, template field is miraculously the one that's shown. So that's the new auto-reducing statement completion that we have in with the Web Forms editor. And so I can say new template field, item template, and then in here I can put in a data binding expression. Okay, we all know about these, the bumblebee hash, as we call it internally. Looks like a little bumblebee. And then generally what you do is something like this, right? You'd have eval and then some column name in here. Problem with these is, they're strings. You don't get any type checking. You don't get any refactoring. You don't get any navigation support. Basically, they just stink. You don't know they're not going to work until runtime. So what we have now is this item member gets generated for you if you set the model type property. And so item is going to be set to the type that you set the model type to. So here I can see I've got item dot and I've got IntelliSense because it knows that the item is an issue. So that's kind of cool. What's even cooler is that if I'm doing this inside something like an attribute, now previously, if you were to do this in Visual Studio 2010, you would get no IntelliSense inside here, no colorization, basically nothing whatsoever. Well, I'm glad to say now that you do get all those things. So you now get IntelliSense inside data binding expressions or response writing expressions inside HTML or server control attributes. So that's another fantastic tooling improvement that's been made. Woo! Yeah! Let's get this party started. Web Forms coming back and yeah. All right, so that was really cool. So if I run this up now, we're going to get an exception because I haven't implemented the method that I told it to go and call, getIssues. Well, I have to implement that method so we can get some data. All right, so let's do that. Go into my code behind, and we'll have a look at what snippets I have in here. Okay, let's say getIssues. Oh, I'm going to do this one manually. It's so simple. Public, I need an iQueryable of issue is what I want to give to my grid view. I'll call it getIssues. And I want to say var db is equal to a new issues db. And I'm going to import that from my model namespace. And then I'm just going to return db.issues. So the issues property was a DB set, if you remember. A DB set is an EF type that implements iQueryable. You all know about iQueryable, right? This is the great link stuff that was introduced in 3.5. So this is just, it's not returning the entire table, okay? It's just returning an expression tree. It's returning a structure that the grid view can use to build essentially a select statement that will then get run against the database. So I'm not returning the entire issues table here. I'm just returning a pointer to the issues table, and the grid view is able to do some stuff on this using the standard linky queryable type of stuff. So if I run this up now, everything going well, I get nothing on the page, which is awesome. So let's have a look and see if my database got created for me. I think I need some more room here. Okay, so I got a database, that's good. Go to my table. I know what I've forgotten. So what I didn't do is tell it to use my initializer. So if I go into my global ASAX, see that comment there to remind me? I need to go ahead and actually initialize this. So I say database.setInitializer, and I want to set it for my Northwind context. So I'm going to say issues, new issues, DB initializer. Oh, I actually have a snippet for this. What am I typing it for? There we go, even better. And I put an extra thing in there. Let's try that again. Oh, that's a really bad snippet. Let's not use that. Let's try this way. Database.setInitializer, new issues DB initializer. Don't do that one. Initializer. Import that. Okay, so now I'm telling the system to go ahead and use this initializer, which was this one back here, for the issues DB context. So if I run that up this time, and I'll have to go and, of course, drop the database because I created it without the initializer. So let's do that. Close this. Come in here. We'll drop this. Delete. Close existing connections. Okay, we'll run that up again. Not that one. Cannot open that. The login failed. That's awesome. Let me close IS Express. By the way, IS Express is now the default web server in Visual Studio 11, not Cassini. Cassini is still there, and that is not running, so let me close this. Open it again. Run it up again. See if I can get it to, there we go. So now get it to coordinate. So if we go back to my database now and look at build 2, wait for SQL Server to catch up. That is interesting. Let's try that again. Database, data source, build 2, refresh. There it is. Okay. Tables. It created that table for me. Issues. If we go and have a look at the columns, we can see that it's created the columns that reflect what was in my class, including the fact that they're required, not null, and it's set the correct string length on them because they, that's what those annotations are for. So that's all fantastic. So very, very quickly, I've got EF set up to create me a database and show that in a grid view. Kind of useful. Thank you. Thank you. Smatterings of applause are always welcome. All right, laughter is also good. So let's go back to our page and let's enhance this with a little bit of more functionality. So I've got a list of issues, but I really want to enable the user to filter by these filter what's shown in these issues a little bit. So to do that, let me add some UI that lets the user filter. So we'll come in here and we'll do a filter panel. So all I have here is a ASP.NET panel, which contains a little bit of UI that the user can use to filter by a date. So I only want to show issues that were created since a certain date. So it's just a label with a text box. There's nothing fancy here at all. Label associated with the text box and the button to go ahead and post back to the server called filter. Okay, it's kind of plain. If I go into here now, I have to modify this method to deal with this new information that I have from the user to do with filtering. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to add a parameter to this method that represents the thing I want to filter by. So I'm going to say it's a date time. It's nullable because they may not provide a date time. And we'll say, I think it's created since. Let's go have a look at what I called it. Yes, I called it created since. And this is where model binding comes into play. So I now have this method that has a parameter. But how is it going to get a value? I have a text box that has a name called created since, and I have a parameter called created since. But I have to do a little bit of glue to tell the model binding system, hey, I want you to get this value from that control. So all I have to do that is decorate the parameter with an attribute. So I'm assuming everyone's used attributes before, right? You've probably used them on classes and maybe properties, but a lot of people I know haven't used them on parameters before because there isn't a lot of use cases where it's really useful. Well, this is a use case where it is useful. So I'm telling the model binding system, get the created since value from the control, and by default, it's going to look for a control with the ID of created since. Now, if you wanted to get it from a different control, you can just pass in the ID to the parameter this way if I called it foo or whatever, and it would look for a control called that. Okay, so now I have to actually go ahead and use this thing. So let's say var query is equal to db.issues. And we'll actually make that an iQueryable of issue. And then I'm going to go ahead and return that query. And then I'm going to conditionally add this where clause. So I'm going to say if created since.has a value, then query is now equal to query.where issue such that issue.createdOn is greater than or equal to created since.value. Okay, so everyone follow what I did there? I've taken a value. If the value is provided, then I'm just going to mutate the query and then give that back to the grid view so that it can go ahead and use it. So let's run that up and see if it works. Okay, so now I have my text box. I've got some stuff here that was created in January. So if I say February 1st, 21, let me add a breakpoint actually. Well, let's see this working. So let's put a breakpoint in here. Let's attach to IS Express. Ooh, that's useful. Let's not do that. Let's just hit F5 because I'm definitely going to pick the wrong one. All right. Okay, let's get rid of that. Let's move this down. So at this point, it's the first page rendering, so this is null. There's no value over here because I haven't put anything in the text box. So let's put something in and hit filter. And so what we should see is that the model binding system has actually given me a date time, which it has, awesome, based on the text value that was entered in that control. I didn't have to do any of that code that says, find the control, get its value, try and parse it into a date. If that succeeded, use the date, check it's the range it's in. I didn't have to do any of that. I didn't have to do any of that UI monkey code. All I had to do was tell the model binding system, hey, do all that for me. So this is really what the model binding system is designed to do. It's designed to work with textual input that comes in from the user and turn it into typed data that you can then use in your code. That's what it does in MVC, and it's what it does in web forms in 4.5. So now if I step through this, I do have a value. I'm going to mutate the query. If I hit F5, you can see now that we've only got 3 records instead of the 4 records that we saw before. If I delete this value and hit filter again, hit F5, and I've now got my 4 values again. So I didn't have any if not is post back. I didn't have any button handlers. I had none of that web formsy type stuff. I just told it, call this method, and then pass in this value from this control. Okay, so I think that's a lot simpler. And I don't have a lot of that code that ties me directly to the page. This code is a lot more transportable now. I could pick it up, drop it in another page, and as that control with the same ID exists, it's just going to work. I don't have to wire up any events anymore. And for those of you thinking, wow, why is he writing code in the code behind? That's a horrible place to put it. Well, maybe. Some people are certainly fine with that. If you want to put the code in a different class, you can absolutely do that. All you have to do is handle a single event on the data-bound control and then give it an instance of the class that the method exists on, and then that's it. You're responsible for creating it and destroying it. We're getting out of that business, like the object data source used to do. All you have to do is give us an instance. So that's cool. All right, so let's add this. Let's do something a little more complicated. How about we filter it to only show issues that I currently created? That could be cool. So let's come in here and add a little bit more UI, and I'm going to put this in a different div. So I'm going to say filter checkbox. So now I'm adding a checkbox with an ID of created by me. So if I look at this page now, obviously what I'm going to see is just another checkbox that I can check to say, hey, only show this if it's created by me. Well, that's kind of useless at the moment because I'm not logged in, so let me log in. Now, obviously, I could write a bit of code to ensure that the checkbox is only shown if the person is logged in. Everyone knows how to do that, so that's fine. So created by me, go ahead and filter, but I have to wire up the back end to support this as well. So let's go back to our method. Let's add another parameter in here now. We'll call this bool. Created by me, I think it was. Okay, then we come in here and we say control again. Okay, control created by me, that's what I called it. And we're going to do something very, very similar. So if created by me dot has a value, query is equal to query dot where I such that I dot created by is equal to. Now, what is it going to be equal to? At the moment, this is a string column. When I'm saving them, which we'll see later when I create them, I'm just putting in the user name, the current username. But what you're probably going to do straight off is something like this. User dot identity dot name, which is totally fine. I mean, you can certainly do this. But the model binding system gives us a lot of power. I mean, who's heard of the concept of dependency injection? Okay, so the idea is, okay, a lot of people. The idea being that rather than this method taking a whole bunch of dependencies, in this case, what have I just done? I've taken a dependency on the page that the method is in. Okay, it might be fine. I mean, if you've got no problem with that, that's totally fine. But a lot of people don't like that. It's now less portable. I couldn't take this and put it on another class now. I'd have to figure out how I'm going to get that value into that class. I could pull it off HTTP context.current, but it makes it very hard to unit test. So there are ways that we can use the model binding system to make this a little bit cleaner. So let's just reorganize these parameters a bit so I can see them. So what if I was to take in the username as just another parameter to my method? So again, it removes the onus on this select method for getting this information. Give it to the model binding system. Let it do it for you. So I want to say, I want a string which is current username. And I'm going to come down here, and instead of doing this, we're going to use that. Okay? Now, obviously, this isn't going to work at the moment because the model binding system has no idea how to get the current username. We do ship with a whole bunch of these value provider attributes, so you can get stuff from the query string, you can get stuff directly from the form collection, you can get stuff from cookies, you can get stuff directly from view state, you can get it from session state, you can get it from profile. But we don't have one that comes from the current user. I mean, this is something I'm just making up. So we can write our own. So let's write our own value provider and value provider attribute that will take care of getting the current username if it exists and passing that in for us. That way I can reuse it throughout my application really, really easily. So let's add that class. I'm going to call it the current user value provider. So a value provider is a concept in model binding. If you've used MVC, you'll understand what a value provider is. Basically, a value provider is just something that knows how to get a value from somewhere. That's all it does. So the current user value provider knows how to get values or a specific value from the current context. And so this is a very, very simple class. It simply says, give me a context in the constructor. It doesn't support prefixes. I'm not going to talk about prefixes today, but that's an advanced thing in model binding that you can implement. And then when getValue is called, go ahead and determine if the user is authenticated. If it is, then get its name. Otherwise, just return an empty string. Really, really simple, but I don't have to put this code in my page anymore. It's in one place. It can get reused throughout my application where I'm using model binding. So now I also need an attribute, so I can wire that up. So let's do that. So the current user attribute, and we'll do that again, current user attribute. So this is a standard attribute. Again, it's not an awful lot of code. We call this a value provider attribute. It's an attribute that knows how to give us a value provider. And all I'm doing when asked for the value provider is returning a new current user value provider, which is the one I just created a moment ago, and passing in an instance of this model binding execution context thing that was passed to us. So that's kind of fine. That's fine. Let's go back to our page now that we've created those two. And let us decorate this with this fantastic new attribute that we've created. So we'll call it the current user attribute. All right, so that should be it. Now, we have to use that. So we're using that created by me has a value, and let's make sure that our current username has a value. So not string.isNull or empty current username. And I'll spell it right. So, okay, so we have to have the checkbox checked, has a value, and created by me.value equals true. I'm going to say equals true because it's not obvious that's a Boolean by looking at the name of it. It's just a little more explicit. And it's not empty. All right, let's run that up again, see if that all works. So come back, hit the home button. I'm still logged in. Okay, so now when I say created by me, and I hit filter, it's only showing the ones created by me. Okay? So again, if we just look at this code, there's nothing in here that's web formsy. It's just talking to a database, dynamically manipulating a query based on some input to the method and then returning the iQueryable. I can take this method, I can put it anywhere, I could unit test it, I can reuse these attributes that I've created to plumb these values in, just like I could in MVC. Now in MVC, we don't have these attributes. The way value providers in MVC works is that there's a static collection of value providers in the app domain in your application, and then whenever a value is required, it just goes through a pre-ordered list until it finds a value or it drops off the bottom. We decided that doesn't really work with the way the web forms page control hierarchy kind of works. It would be very easy for you to suddenly introduce a security problem whereby you have, hey, yeah, get this from, I have a parameter called created by me, and you think that's coming from a control, but then someone hacks the query string and now it's coming from the query string. I mean, MVC suffers from this problem as well, but we figured for web forms it was much better to be explicit. I will show you at the end how you can customize this to do whatever you really want it to do. So that's kind of cool. So now I've got filtering. So let's do something a little more complicated. Let's add a little bit more UI. Let's go ahead and do a master details type situation. So currently I'm not showing all the information. I'm just showing a summary in this grid view. Let's go ahead and add, let's say, issue form view. So I'm going to add a form view that's going to show the record that's currently selected in my grid view. Okay, standard master detail type of situation. So I'm going to enable, I'm going to say auto generate the select button. So now I can select something in the grid view. And you'll look at the form view, it's pretty basic. It's a standard templates for editing and inserting. I've set the default mode to edit. I just don't want a read-only mode for this sample. I've set the model type to the issue as well. And I've set the select method and the insert method and update method. Let's just get rid of those for the moment. We don't want those. Let's do the select method for the moment. So let's implement that select method. Let's come down here. After here, I'm just going to implement get issue. Public, we want just a single issue this time, get issue. And I need an issue ID. So I'm going to say int nullable ID. And I'm going to say return. Now I want to reuse this DB rather than creating a new one every time. So I'm just going to do a little bit of refactoring on the fly. We'll say a private, where's my DB? There it is, new issues DB, issues DB, underscore DB equals new issues DB. And then we'll get rid of this. And we'll change that to use that. Then we'll come down here, and I'm going to return that .find, .issues.find by that ID. So find is a method on the entity framework entity sets that get generated. Just lets you find a record by its primary ID. And now I have to tell the model binding system, where do I get the value for ID from? Well, I'm going to get it from that other control, the grid view. So I'm going to tell it to get the value from that other grid view, which I called my issues grid from memory. Okay, pretty good. Let's run that up again, see what happens. Oh, data keys must be specified, so let's go ahead and do that. Data keys on here, data key names is equal to ID. What that was saying is that because I hadn't told it what the ID of this was, when I tried to get the value of it from that other method, it says, well, I don't know what the current value of the grid view is because you don't have a data key. I need to know what the primary key is before I can give you the current value. Let's try to see if that fits it. Okay, so I have a grid view. I have a little bit of empty information down here from my form view saying select an issue from the grid view above to view its details or create a new issue. We haven't implemented that yet. So if I hit select, you can see I am moving through these and it's updating as you would expect. Now, no, I didn't write any code to re-data bind any of these things. The model binding system will keep track of the value of these parameters across postbacks. So if we go and have a look at this parameter here, when the model binding system calls this method and it knows that it gets the value from this control, it stores the original value in view state. And so when you post back, it can figure out whether that value has changed because that control now has a different value. And if so, it'll automatically rebind the form view and call this method again. Now, the object data source used to do this as well, okay? But the model binding system does this as well now. So I didn't have to write any code again to worry about rebinding things when I go ahead and select stuff. Okay, so that's kind of cool. Let's change tracks a little bit and look at some of the other enhancements that have happened with model binding to help protect your application. So what about encoding information on the page? By default, in .NET 4.5, the HTML encoder, we made it pluggable in the previous version, is now the anti-XSS encoder. Has anyone ever used the anti-XSS encoder that came out from the PnP group? A couple of hands, okay. So this was a much more strict HTML encoding library that helps to prevent situations where you created anti-cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in your application. So now whenever you call the HTTP utility, whatever it is, .encode method, or you use one of these encoded response writing expressions, this one with the colon that we introduced in 4.0, that's going to automatically go through anti-XSS. Now what didn't exist in the previous version was a way to do that with data binding expressions. So if we go down here and look at my edit item template, you'll see I've got a panel with the grouping text attribute set to this data binding expression where I'm outputting the name, the title. Okay? Now, by default, these do not get encoded. Now, if you put this on the attribute of some controls, the control will encode it for you. So that's kind of nice. But if you're just echoing it out into the page or you're doing what I'm doing here, it's not going to get encoded, which means that you're susceptible to things like this. So if I come into here, say we have a nasty user, and they put something like this in. Okay, so I've saved that in my database via whatever mechanism. I come back in here and I hit home, and I select this one here. Oh dear. My site has now been hacked. Now you might be thinking, I mean, who has never heard of cross-site scripting? Everyone has heard of it, good. So you all know why this is dangerous. I now have JavaScript that I wrote executing in the context of this page as a certain user. I'm free to do whatever I want. I could grab all the cookies for this domain, pipe them off to some AJAX request, and now I have your current session. I can log in as you and do whatever the hell I want. Okay, so this is a really, really intense problem that you really need to be wary of when building public applications and even intranet applications. Well, I'm glad to say that this is easy to fix now. Oops. You can just put a colon in front of this expression now, and if we look at this page again, we can see that it got automatically encoded by the anti-XSS encoding library. So no longer is it going to be treated as HTML and executed. It's going to be encoded and just rendered as text on the page. So that's nice to see as well. Now previously, of course, you could do that, but you'd have to come in here and go HTTP utility.html. You'd have to write all that code to make it do that, and you'd have to remember to do that everywhere. Now, by default, if you're ever echoing out into the page, you should just be using the hash or the pound colon sign to do that. Okay, so we fixed that problem. That's cool. What if I want to allow that type of information into these controls? So let's go ahead and add editing support to this. So let's say update method is equal to update issue. And we'll say the insert method. Oh, that's really not the snippet I wanted. IM, maybe? Control J, IM method? No, we'll just do it the hard way then. Insert method equals insert issue. Go into my code behind, and we'll add those methods. Zoom that back out a bit. Insert update issue. Okay, so let's have a quick look at what these methods are doing. So we looked at the select method, we've looked at filtering. Now we're going to look at how we can insert records and update records. So I have an insert issue record. It's taking in the current username based on that current user attribute that I created before. And I'm just checking to see if they're logged in. If they're not, then I'm adding an error to model state. So let's pause here because this is a new concept. So the idea of model state represents the current state of the model binding system on your page. So whenever model binding is invoked, if any errors happen during the model binding cycle, then they will have members in the model state dictionary. Now, that's useful in a couple of ways. One, you can make them show on the page just by adding a validation summary. So in this template, I have a validation summary. You can see down here I have a validation summary. And I've set this new property, show model state errors equal to true. So now any model state errors on my page are going to show up in this validation summary. And also I can add custom errors in here. So I'm just adding a generic model error to my page saying, hey, you must be signed in to create any new records. If that's all fine, what I'm going to do is go ahead and create myself a new issue, set the created by property to the current user, and then I'm going to call try update model. This is where the real magic of the model binding system comes into place. So when we looked at model binding creating values in here, we call that implicit model binding. the model binding system called this method and it implicitly tried to bind things into these parameters because you had these attributes. Okay? Even if you didn't have attributes, it would try to put a value in there, but it just wouldn't know where to get them from. By default, with these methods, the only place it's going to get values from are the bind expressions in your template. Try update model is explicit model binding. This is saying I have an instance of my model. In this case, it's an issue. And I want you to, right now, try and bind information from the request into this model. Okay? Now, when you call try update model from inside a model binding method, like insert issue or update issue, where it's going to get the values from are the data binding expressions. So if we go back to my page and we look at the template for edit item, was it edit or insert I was looking at? Insert. Let's look at insert. You can see I have a binding expression for title and a binding expression for description. Now, previously, you would have done it this way. Bind title, and you have the same problems that you have with eval. Well, now that we've got strongly typed data binding, I can just say bind item, and I get IntelliSense for these things. Okay, just like we got for item before, and we get it for bind item as well. So it's only going to look for values from the controls that contain these data binding expressions when you call try update model. Okay, so it's a little bit different from the implicit binding. The implicit binding, remember, was this bit here. You had to tell it where the values come from. With explicit binding, you call it explicitly, but it's going to get the values from the data binding expressions in your control. And so after we call try update model, my issue will be the issue I created here with created by set to the current user plus whatever it was able to bind off those data binding expressions. Then I could go ahead and check if the model state is valid, and if it is, if there were no errors in that model binding operation, I'm just going to go ahead and save those changes to the database. And the save changes method I'll just show you is very, very simple. It just calls db.savechanges. db is my EF context, and I'm just going to redirect back to this page again so that everything reloads. So let me run that up. Close the previous one. Okay, so I'm going to say create a new issue. And I can say, this is a new issue. And we'll say, hello. Have I got more than one going? That doesn't matter. Hit save, and it says, you must be signed in to create new issues, because I had that code that did that. So let's go ahead and log in. Damien, super secret password, create a new issue. This is a new issue. Okay, and there it is. This is a new issue that happened down there. So let's step through that to see this actually happening, and look at what happens when I try and do things that perhaps I shouldn't be doing. So let's get rid of that breakpoint. Let's create a new issue. This is a new issue. Again. And I'm going to leave description blank this time. Okay, so I'm inside my method here. Current user is currently set to null, which is not useful at all. Apparently I'm logged out again. Let's try that again. Log in. Okay, create a new issue. This is a new issue again. We'll leave that blank. Okay, now current user has a value on it. Create my new issue. So at the moment, all this issue has on it is when it was created, because I had that in the constructor of the issue, my name and no other values. Okay. Then I'm going to go ahead and call try update model. Now my issue has the title, because it came from that text box. The binding expression was in that text box. Is model state valid? False. Now, my model state is not valid. Why is my model state not valid? Because my description is missing. So what that's telling us is that the model binding system honors these data annotations that you put on your model. And it's just the way it works in MVC. It also works this way in web forms. Now, this is separate to the page validation system in web forms. I could still have validators on here if I wanted to have client-side validation. And if you use dynamic data in here, you'll get the benefit of both. Because the dynamic data field templates will automatically put on server validators that map to these data annotation attributes right here. Okay? So at the moment, though, I'm just relying on the model binding system to do my validation for me. So it's invalid, which is great. So I'm not going to go ahead and save those changes. And that's it. I'm just returning from the method. I'm not doing anything else. And if I hit F5 and come back, we'll see that the form view knows what to do. The form view detected that there's a model state error. The validation summary is in that template, so it shows all the model state errors. In this case, the description field is required. So I can just fix that. And it left it in the edit mode. And I can hit save again.
We'll go through this one more time. It should issue, try update model. My issue this time has my description of test. My model is valid now, goes ahead and saves the changes, redirects, and here's my new issue again created down the bottom. Okay. Now, updating is a very, very similar process. So if I come in here, let's get rid of this, and we'll add a breakpoint into the update method. Get rid of this one. Come down in here. Save this. Come back. Okay. I'm going to find the existing issue. So this time, my update issue takes the ID of the issue I want to update, which is set to 1, so it knows where that came from. The way the model binding system knows that is because I set the data key names property on the form view. So it knows to automatically try and push that into the method. Now, incidentally, you could take the entire issue object as a parameter here if you want to do that. And then it will implicitly model bind everything from the data control into that issue at that point. Generally, you're not going to do that, though, because it's going to new up an issue from scratch and then just try and push values onto it. But most of the time, you don't show every single field in the UI. You only show a subset of the fields. So generally what you'll do is you'll read the record from the database into EF, then you'll push the new values onto the record, and you'll get the benefit of EF doing its change tracking. So that EF object now knows the old value and the new value, and then you'll save those changes, which is what we're doing here. So I find the record. Here's the record here. I could add some code here to handle if the record doesn't exist, but I've been lazy here. Try update the model. So now my record has the values that I just put in. I remove the script tag from there. If it's valid, it is. I go ahead and save the changes again, and my update has happened very similarly to how my insert has happened. Very, very simple, very, very basic, standard data access type of code. Nothing specifically web formsy about this. Okay. So let's do, any questions on this before I move on to some slightly more advanced things? Yes? Yep. So the question is, if I wanted to move all this code into a different class, essentially, I wanted to separate, have a mid-tier. Yes, you can do that. Not in the build that you currently have. Unfortunately, the developer preview doesn't have this capability. What you will be able to do is there's a single event that you can handle on the grid view or the form view, whatever control it is you're using, which gets fired before this method gets called. It's like calling model method. And the event args in there, you can give us an instance of the class that has all your logic. And then it'll just call the method on that class. In the methods in that case, we'll also pass in another parameter. So your method can take in another parameter, which is a model binding context. And that gives you the model state and the extra things that you need to be able to do all the code that you see here. Because you won't have the model state property, you won't have the try update model method in your class. That's on the page class. So you'll take this extra class in as a parameter, and then you'll be able to call try update model, you'll be able to call model state. They're all mockable, they're virtual, you can do all unit test those and everything, that's all totally fine. Totally up to you. I'm not going to tell you whether you should be putting your database variable in the code behind or whether you should be putting it under 7 layers of abstraction. That's totally up to you and what makes you happy. This is much easier to demo. And a lot of people are very happy writing code this way. But what I hope I'm showing you is that this method has nothing tying it to the page. So you could pick it up and place it anywhere that you wanted to. Yes? The question was, do the control IDs need to match the property names? No. So if you remember down here, we have an example of where the property name is ID, but the control ID is issues grid. For the try update model, no, because what it's actually using is not the control name, but the data binding expression. So it's not the fact that this is called title that means it's going to get bound onto title. It's the fact that it has a data binding expression specifically for bind item dot title. So unlike MVC, where it actually does it like on a name matching, looks at the string and then tries to match it that way, you can do that in web forms. If I get time, I'll very quickly show you how. But using this method, if you're using a form views have this two-way data binding capability, which you set up using binding expression. So they're the things that dictate where it comes from. Yes? 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 If it can't parse the value in. So the question is, I've got date time here, but what if I entered foo? No, it doesn't blow up. what you end up with is a model state that's invalid, because it would have attempted to bind a value on, and you can go in the dictionary and see that there's a value attempted for that value, but the model state will be invalid. So that's why I've got if created since has value, because if it couldn't bind it in, it'll be null. It has no value to give it. So that's how you sort of handle when it couldn't do it. Okay, so we've got about 5 minutes left, so let me quickly, what I'm going to do is jump over to a completed solution to show you some of the other things that you can do with the model binding system. So let's open this page up again, and we'll run this one up. Let me close down IS Express because I just don't trust it to remember or not remember. Okay, and then we close the solution, reopen the solution, and then run it up. So this solution I'll make available on my blog. So when you get the bits, you can look at how all this works. You'll see that I've got the code in here to not show the checkbox unless I'm logged in. So I'm going to log in. Damien, password. So now I've got created by me. You'll see that when I click in the created since, I've got a nice date picker instead of just text. So how did that happen? Well, and also if I select one of these, I've got the same nice date picker down here in here. So how did I do that? Well, that's a jQuery UI date picker. Anyone use jQuery UI? Okay. So I've done that in an interesting way. So if we go into my scripts folder, I've imported this jQuery-UI.unobtrusive.js file. This is a NuGet package. I go down here and say get package, and we wait. There we go. Get package. We can see that I've got this unobtrusive.jQuery.ui package installed. And then if we go in here, I've also installed the dynamic data field templates. So you can see here, dynamic data templates. So if you've used dynamic data, you'll know that all the UI in dynamic data is driven by user controls. It's driven by templates. By default, they're installed away in the program file somewhere, but you can edit them. You can pull them into your project, and then you can modify them. And so I'm actually using dynamic data. So by default, with model binding or strongly typed data controls, if you set the model type property of your grid view or your form view, it'll be automatically enabled for dynamic data. You don't have to do anything else. As soon as you have a model associated with it, it'll enable dynamic data. That enables you to do things like this. If I come down to my grid view and look at my edit item template, you can see that the date now is a dynamic control. It's no longer a text box. I've simply said, show the UI for the created on data field in the edit mode. And it knew that it's a date time, so it has to render that as a text box. And the reason it knows that is because in dynamic data over here, I have a field template called date time edit. So this is just the default one. I've only made one change, which is this. I've added the data-UI-fn date picker attribute to this. Now this is a data-HTML5 attribute that the unobtrusive jQuery JavaScript knows how to find, and then after the page loads, it'll automatically run the date picker jQuery UI widget on this text box. Okay, so very, very easily and very simply without me having to write any JavaScript or having to do this over and over in my application, I've got that nice date picker in this application. Now for the filter at the top, I'm not using dynamic data because that's not inside a data control, it's just on the page, it's up here. So I just add data UI fn date picker directly onto the text box and I get the date picker there as well. So that was kind of nice. What else does it do? Well, who has ever had to deal with optimistic concurrency in their application? No, really? Okay, the hands come up now. Good, good, good. So optimistic concurrency, the idea of database concurrency is if you've got more than one user using your application at the same time, and they both go to perform a similar operation on the same record. So this guy wants to update something as wrong to 7, and this guy wants to update it to 8. Well, this guy hits save first, and I haven't signed in over here, so let me go ahead and do that. Okay, select that. We'll make this one 8. And I'm going to hit save. And that one's worked. That's gone through. It's now something is wrong 8. Now this guy is going to try and hit save now. And I get an exception. Unexpected number, and that's not the exception I was expecting. I will fix this before I send it up. But you can see entities, that is the exception I was expecting. Entities may have been modified or deleted since entities were loaded. Refresh Object State Manager entities. So what we've got is a concurrency exception from EF. Okay? What didn't work is that's supposed to be handled, but let me show you the code, how this works. So if I come down to my update issue code here in the last 40 seconds, in Save Changes, we're handling the DB update exception here. And if it's an optimistic concurrency exception, I go ahead and add a model error that says, hey, this record has changed since you originally loaded it. Do you want to go ahead and overwrite your changes? And then I have a checkbox that's on the page that they can tick that only shows up if that error occurs. Then they can hit Save Changes again, and it forces the changes to be saved into the database. So I'll post that up so you can see how that type of thing is done as well. Very quickly, the other examples that you have in here that you can look at when you download it are how to use model binding with a different ORM. I've shown you entity data, the entity framework, but this is using the Massive system. So Massive is a very tiny ORM from Rob Connery, and it uses dynamic objects. So if we look in the code behind for this, you can see I'm returning an I enumerable of dynamic, okay, which is kind of cool. And then over here, the model type of this is set to dynamic, and now item is actually a dynamic item. And so these properties are being generated at runtime, and I can still data bind to them, which is kind of cool. The very other one in here is an example of ad hoc model binding. If you like the idea of model binding doing all this UI to data value code for you, but you don't like the data controls for whatever reason, you hate the grid view and you hate the form view, you want to do it manually, this ad hoc sample shows you how you can use plain old input tags, and then you can do the work to manually inu up a form value provider and then call try update model and passing in that form value provider. Tell the system to only bind values from form, in page load, and then, hey, you can now do sort of model view presenter or MVVM inside web forms and have the model binding system take care of getting the values from the page into your model. So enabling much more advanced scenarios out of the box that you simply couldn't do before without writing a whole bunch of code. Okay, so the last 2 minutes over my talk. For more information, there is a hands-on lab that you can do right here while you're here at Build. So go to the hands-on lab, look for the Web Forms 4.5 hands-on lab, and you can basically go through and do everything that I showed you here in a structured learning process. There's a bunch of other talks here that you might be interested in. What's new in Visual Studio? There's an MVC talk talking about mobile applications, which is really interesting. And the ASP NET 4.5 Love HTML5, CSS3, and JavaScript talk, which was given earlier today. Watch that one online if you haven't seen it. That's very cool. If you go up to www.asp.net/vnext right now, you'll find a whole a chunk of content about everything that I showed you today, plus a whole bunch of other fantastic new features in web forms and ASP.NET that I didn't get to show you. So thank you very much. Please fill in your feedback. Feel free to send me email. And thank you for coming to Build.